2.5 years ago, in a New York Times newspaper, I read Elisa Gabbert's column on poetry for the first time. The piece was called "The Shape of the Void, Toward a Definition of Poetry." I loved it so much I kept the singular square of newsprint it fills. On the flip side of the square, another poet, Srikanth Reddy, proclaims, "There are two kinds of poets in this world. Poets who write poetry and poets who don't." Today I want to talk about the latter. Poetry can be something as physical as a hand gesture, as invisible as sound. It can be written down on the corner of a napkin, or an emotion altered by time. Poetry can be an idea personified, never documented, but remembered. A person can be a poet, and their life poetic. But how can a person do what prose does? How can a human being achieve the immateriality of the poetic? What is the potential of that? I think about that a lot. What is it to be a poet and not write poetry? And what does a poem teach us? Elisa says in her column that poetry leaves something out. It leaves a lot out. She explains, verse, by forcing more white space on a page, is constantly reminding us of what's not there. The absence of something. This hyper-present absence. These fragments, the missingness, slows the reader down to make them search for what isn't there. And this, as she keenly mentions, is erotic. By this logic, all of life, which lies ahead, is erotic, the unknown. But the poet exercises eroticism like an exhibitionist, uses the unknown like a vessel, as Elisa would say. The poet diverges from the average person because of some secret, one seemingly entrusted to them. And like the words still left on the page, the poetic person accentuates what is already there, extends it, and embellishes it. The poet might recall an evening like it was only glass fringe beads that hung from a lamp, the vague smell of musk, a few words scribbled on a bathroom stall. The poet might remember a man for his cufflinks, the color of the sheets, for the first letter of his name, or even give him a new name that suits him better. Things are left to flourish within the imagination not only of the poet, but also of the audience. What is shown to us is stretched beyond truth, and the absence which surrounds it intensifies it. Now, some people would call this lying. Elisa says in her column that the poet does not merely achieve poetry because of some deliberate lie or an obfuscating of truth. What the poet withholds is a call to action. Eroticism asks us to investigate, to roam and discover. The poet says, "Come hither," just like a bare leg does, the rest of a body covered in sheets. But the body is still there. The body is not a lie, just like what a poet conceals is not a lie, just unknown. Often a poem asks you to question it, to know more, to decode. But I find some of the most beautiful poems stand alone, just the green words, obscured and empathetically mutilated creatures of thought, but beautiful nonetheless. Perhaps a new breed of beauty, something which surfaced from the dark, a new virtue with no known origin. Sometimes I wonder if obscurity could be included in Plato's forms, that the obscure is something pure and immutable and inherently good, and that lies are a result of human inadequacy, that the lie is obscurity degenerated somehow. The poet, like the artist, tries to achieve the divine, tries at perfection as an imperfect person. They do the best with the tools they're given, and unfortunately that results in deception. It is difficult for me when thinking about poetry to avoid thinking about lying. There is such poetry in secrets, no doubt, and strength in the arcane, but I don't think it is this reason to which some ancient philosophers credit their hatred of poetry. I think it is because the lies poetry can tell alter us. It can alter reality. What is unknown in a poem or in a poet leads the mind to create false realities that can become real. Are poems a bastardization of truth, or are they a new truth? one which can transcend reality. What happens when you are no longer able to differentiate between what is real from what is left out? One of my favorite plays is A Streetcar Named Desire, and my favorite character of all time is Blanche. Blanche goes mad because she cannot reconcile with reality, and her illusions shatter. But I think if you read this play, if you really analyze Blanche's character, you would root for her and condemn her fate, because Blanche is a poet, and her obscurity is a hope for absolution. Blanche clings to illusion, youth, beauty, and theater because they represent a higher truth, one dislodged from the shortcomings of reality. She famously screams, "I don't want realism. I want magic." I try to give that to people. I misrepresent things to them. I don't tell the truth. I tell what ought to be the truth. What ought to be the truth. And what about the film, The Dark Knight? What about Bruce's idea of truth and lies, virtue and morality? At the end of The Dark Knight, after Harvey Dent turns into a sociopath and avenges his enemies, what does Batman do? He takes Harvey's crimes onto himself and allows the illusion of Harvey's goodness to live on. His image of goodness. What is that if not a lie accepted as truth? An illusion of incorruptibility that we need as people. Batman is a poet. He is a poet because he does not accept the truth. For he says himself, the truth is not enough. People need something more. A poet makes a choice. They are the arbiters of truth. Whatever is missing, redacted, or changed, poetry takes the form that it does because it's how it ought to be, not how it is. Poets are gods of hope. They do not wait, like us, for their God to save them. They save themselves from the cruelty of realism. Anaïs Nin once said that the greatest of all joys is to be able to retrace one's lies, to sleep one night a year washed of all superstructures. Obscurity does not just circumvent the truth, it supersedes it. The poet uses obscurity to create a better world, one where beauty reigns, where evil, where ugliness recede, where crimes against us can be effaced. There's all this talk about realism and illusion, so why don't we consider dreams then? What about the mistakes of our memory? Have you ever mistaken a dream for reality? I myself have had dreams long ago which have been so obscured by time that I've mistaken them for memory, for truth. And this false memory embedded itself into who I was. It became part of my story, only for me to be told a decade later that I was wrong. I remember now that both David Lynch and Lady Gaga have mentioned that how someone remembers something is perhaps more accurate than how the events actually transpired. Is that an answer that we can live with? What was once a lie can become truth, and vice versa? If poetry invades our lives unconsciously, what are we to do? What does that say about our nature, about existence? Does a false memory which managed to survive in the real world without harming a soul require correction? Is an invented reality really all that absurd, or do we need invented realities? To retrace one's lies. Anaïs Nin kept 2 diaries, one in which she documented reality, and the other which held elaborate lies for her husband, if he were to ever find that diary. She had a lie box with alibis. She had trouble with her taxes because she was claimed as a dependent by 2 different men. There are augmentations in Nin's diaries even after the unabridged versions came out that seem to be too flagrant to be real. Even when she wrote in the Diary of Truth, she lied to herself. She told herself what ought to be the truth. Anaïs Nin started her diaries as a letter to her father, a man that psychologically and physically abused her since she was a toddler. And if you read them, they feel like a stage. Her diaries never feel personal because they were never for her, even decades after her first entries. But they were a place of her own creation, a place where she was in control of the narrative. Who wouldn't want to obscure their trauma? Can poetry not act like restitution, the poet a redeemer, to take back ownership of something which someone had stolen from you? Anaïs had managed to convincingly love and withhold 2 husbands from each other. She successfully led 2 lives, her image not tarnished. She was able to wear the costume of her lies, and they never corrupted her soul, as she had said herself. When Blanche is confronted by her lover, he tells her that she is lies, lies, inside and out. And she quickly comes to correct him, and she says, never from the inside, not in my heart. Poetry hails from an incorruptible, pure source, and is sought for redemption. The poet, like the trustee of secrets, bears an incredible burden to be better than they are, to try to convince us that the unknown holds something just within reach, holds our transcendence. If what is concealed in the dark is never revealed, then what is it? It's like that proverbial tree in the forest, but better. The thing concealed is what we say it is, but it isn't that easy. It's not just blind faith. It has to be unfaltering belief. The poet lives their poetry each day. It is a life sentence. To be a poet, if you don't care to write, you make a choice. You are the arbiter of recollection, a procurer of truth as it ought to be known. Which dreams will you allow to become memories, and inevitably add to the down in your coat? Who will you become because of your illusions? What will the world you create look like? Will it be a good world? A better world? Elisa's article ends with hope. Get ready. You must change your life. The poet holds the power of change, a technique used by those who stand at the lip of the unknown, who obscure their fear with words and call it optimism.